Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk to Clause 53, which relates to transitional provisions concerning gradual workplace disease. This relates to a change that is being made in the Act, which disentitles some people who can currently prove a workplace accident relating to gradual process and disease, but after this transitional provision comes into effect, won't. And I want to explain to those who are interested what the nature of the changes being made and how that is unfair. Currently, it's quite hard to prove a work-related gradual process disease or infection. If you have an illness, there are often a lot of possible causes of that illness. If you have an illness that may be related to exposure to chemicals at work or on a farm, for example, then you have to be able, there's some onus on you to show that it is the exposure to those chemicals that causes your disease and not some other cause. And I would have thought that's quite a hard test, albeit an appropriate test to meet. And one of the ways in which the corporation goes about assessing whether this link is sufficiently proven is through ministerial advisory groups of experts who look into these things, and as the quality of science improves and their knowledge as to these links grow, the decisions that are made by ACC no doubt become better. Incidentally, another provision in this legislation is to do away with those advisory boards, which seem to me to be necessary and ought not to be disposed of. But my point in respect of this is that in addition to that existing test, this legislation introduces another impediment to getting cover, and that's found in Clause 7 of the bill, which doesn't come into effect until Clause 53 transitional provisions apply. But that new test says that you're not going to be able to get compensation for work-related disease caused by exposure to chemicals if that same material is found to any material extent in the non-employment activities or environment of the person. So if you've got exposure to chemicals at work that cause disease now, then you can get ACC if it's caused the disease. But they're now going to deem it that you didn't get it from work, if you have material exposure outside of work, at home. Doesn't have to be greater exposure at home, it just has to be some material exposure. Now, I could even understand if employers were saying, oh look, we're paying for the cost of non-work related exposure to these events. That's too tough. Maybe there should be some rating, maybe there's sort of some pro rata assessment of whether that injury should fall inside the employer's scheme or outside the scheme. That could be fair. I can see myself being persuaded that if there was a part work cause and a non-work cause, that it should be ratably proportionally divided and put to the different accounts. Or indeed, if there's no compensation for work-related disease outside of work, which there isn't, that you don't get full compensation if part of it was caused outside of work. But to completely take away cover from someone who has some disease that is work-related because some of their disease was not work-related, well, that's just wrong. That's unfair. That's denying the reality that this person has suffered work-related disease as a consequence to exposure to chemicals at work. And these things are real. I think most people who run constituency clinics will have met people. This was one that's dying out as technology changes. But there was a period when we had a lot of people coming to see us who worked in photographic processing shops, and they were exposed to the chemicals of is it glutaraldehyde? Glutaraldehyde. I'm told that's the chemical. I don't know that from memory myself. But those chemicals cause skin problems, they cause respiratory problems, and they have, in some cases, people have terribly affected lives. And these are not minor consequences; these are life-changing events. Now, this would say that if you were an amateur photographer and presumably some of these people are amateur photographers, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Honourable David Parker.
That you would no longer be entitled to compensation relating to the gradual the disease that you had suffered, or the infection that you had suffered, the injury that you had suffered as a consequence to the exposure of those chemicals at work, despite the fact that the vast majority of your exposure to those chemicals is at work, and therefore it is the cause of your injury. That, in my opinion, goes too far. As I said, I could understand an argument to ratably apportion it between the two different causes, but to say that just because there is a material effect from the out-of-work exposure, you should get no compensation, no right to any compensation for your work-related injury, goes too far. And again, this question is, why are we doing this? We already know that work-related accident compensation levies for employers in New Zealand are lower than they are anywhere in the world that we're aware of. The only information we had to the committee was the comparison with Australia, and it clearly showed that costs for employers are already lower. So what's the justification then for reducing them further by effectively excluding cover for what are real injuries? I want to say something also about what John Boscawen said. John Boscawen said costs are going up, therefore we should truncate the scheme. Yes, it is true medical costs are going up. They're going up for a number of reasons. There has been high health sector inflation. I think that will abate. But there are ever more sophisticated procedures available to ensure that people live healthier, longer lives than they used to in the face of disease. And that does cost. And as a country, we face the pressures of meeting that additional cost. And we make choices. We make choices as to how the extra wealth that's generated in a society is allocated. And every country in the world, as it grows wealthier, and we're a country that grows wealthier over time, every country in the world over time chooses to do what people choose to do everywhere else, and that is, if they've got a bit of disposable income or more disposable income, they choose to spend more of that disposable income every year on healthcare, because healthcare is so intrinsically important to quality of life. So if people had the choice of spending more, if they can afford it, on quality of life, they do. And as a country, we can afford to pay more for quality of life every year, and we do. And we shouldn't be stuck in some 1950s paradigm saying that that was all we could afford back there, therefore all we should try and aspire to afford these days is the level of cover that we used to have previously. That is not the way for New Zealand. We want to have the same improving quality of service and medical services in New Zealand as the economy improves and as technology improves, because that's called progress. And, you know, it seems to me that some of the comments that we heard from John Boscawen said, well, no, the reality is these things all become too expensive. You just have to have a ring fence and say, I'm sorry, you're not going to get anything more. I disagree with that view of Mr. Boscawen. I think that we can, as a country, pick up some of these additional costs because we do become wealthier as our economy grows. That is not to say that we ought not to be prudent and try and manage costs. I certainly agree we ought to be maximising rehabilitation costs so as to minimise those costs, but I'm certainly not one of those people that thinks that we should have as an objective keeping expenditure in these areas static, because in reality we can't, unless we're going to freeze ourselves in time and slowly become a backward country. Sir, I'd also like to talk about the residual levy. There are provisions in this part of the bill that I do agree with. One of the problems of ACC's levy setting process is that because changes in rates and return can have an enormous effect on the pool that's needed to fund some of these old residual claims over time, the change in the parameter of expectation as to what the rate of return on investments will be for the next 20 years might go from 5% to 4.5%, and that has many billions of dollars effect on the pool of assets that are required to be held by ACC to meet the long-term life of those old claims. That number bounces around every year and causes real volatility in the levy that's set for those residual claims, particularly as we approach the end of that. Now, we're doing two things here. We're extending the date from 2014 to 2019, which is good. But the other thing that I think is a wise policy decision by the government, on which I congratulate them, is to actually